The 2019 Summer Institute in Migration Research Methods provided 6 days of training in the use and analysis of migration data at Penn State University, targeting early career scholars. The Institute drew local and national experts to train attendees and provide on-site mentorship. Most participant costs were covered thanks to an award from the Russell Sage Foundation and the Carnegie Corporation of New York.
What's fun about our two speakers is they're coming from two different disciplines. Helen Marrow is a sociologist at Tufts University. Michael Jones-Correa is a political scientist at Penn. And they're going to be sharing some of their tips and tricks and also their experiences doing mixed methods, both in their own research but also as team-based work. And there are trade-offs on both of those sides. So please join me in welcoming Helen and Michael.
I want to start off with a couple of slides from Feliz Garib's ethno-survey and mixed methods in migration research presentation from last year, because some of what she laid out there I think is really useful for where we go here. And she notes, right, what is a mixed methods approach? There can be different approaches to mixed methods, right? One typical one, right, is that you mix different kinds of data, and it's typically a qualitative with a quantitative type of data, but not always, right? It can be two kinds of quantitative methods or two kinds of qualitative methods, different approaches. Another approach, right, is to analyze quantitative data qualitatively or analyze qualitative data quantitatively, right? You might think of a content analysis of media. You often analyze qualitative content, both quantitatively, right, through counts, as well, and frequencies, right, as well as qualitatively if you're looking for frames and messages. She also notes that there are different rationales for mixed methods, right? One reason and rationale you might choose to use two or more methods in the same project is to confirm, using different data or methods, some kind of finding, right? To, in a sense, triangulate and have more a surety that you're getting what you're getting through different methods. But another rationale is that different methods, right, have different points of view, different ways of thinking about the same kind of topic, and so you may be more exploratory here, right? You may be using different methods as complementary, right, to think about what you're trying, your research question in different ways. There are also different designs for mixed methods that she lays out. I'll show you a couple of examples, right? One design is sequential, right? When you have one method and you get some findings and then you employ another method after that, right? You move in a sequence through your mixed methods. A different design is nested or non-nested, right? That you have one kind of method here and you nest another method within it. That's nested. Non-nested means they're separate from each other. They're related, but they're separate. So I'll show you some examples. And she ends that presentation with some lessons. I think we'll come back to this at the end, right? That mixed methods research reveals novel insights, but it can also be hard, right? Because the different methods use different, they're based on different epistemologies, and they have different expectations, right? Ethnographers, right, have different expectations for what they want you to find and what they want you to be paying attention to. That's very different, right, from experimental research and quantitative surveys, right? So it can be hard to put these things together as well. Just some slides from her presentation, right, to give you some examples of different kinds of ways people set up mixed methods project, right? She is an expert in using the Mexican Migration Project, if you're familiar with those ethno-surveys, right? And the ethno-survey, as she explains in that presentation, is really a way you collect survey data by using in-depth interviews, right? So it's already a mixed method design, but nonetheless, right, there's an example she gives here of a sequential, semi-nested, and complementary design where you can analyze the MMP survey data and you can find and identify communities that have different patterns of out-migration in Mexican communities. And then based on those data, right, you can nest within them afterwards, right, sequentially, some interviews with people in different kinds of communities that you're particularly interested in, right, to see those patterns happening and to illustrate them in real life, right? So this is an example of that sequential, semi-nested, complementary design. A different design, a sequential, non-nested complementary design that she gave last year, also using the MMP, right? An example where you might use qualitative data first, and the results of that qualitative data to then design your survey questions, your instrument for quantitative analysis, right? So it's sequential in that you're employing qualitative interviews first, and then later you're going to use those to build a quantitative survey instrument, right? It's not necessarily nested, right? One is not nested when the other one precedes the other. But again, these are both complementary. It's the idea, right, that interviews or ethno-surveys or survey data explore a certain question or topic from different angles, right, in ways that can be complementary. And finally, she used this example, The Diversity Paradox, Jennifer Lee and Frank Bean's book from a couple of years ago. This is a concurrent plus sequential, non-nested, complementary, and confirmatory design, right? It's kind of funny, but you're going to see that kind of combination coming up a lot in our other projects, right? Where in their project, right, they first analyze census data, and they're looking at rates of intermarriage, racial intermarriage, right, and they're relating them back to compositional factors. They're also conducting qualitative interviews with mixed race families and parents of interracial children, right, to capture changing attitudes and cultural factors, right? These are the non-nested, right, but concurrent ways that they're approaching that topic. But then they use the results of both, right, to inform the path analysis that they then use to confirm the mechanisms, right, underneath their topic, right? So that's the sequential part. This is the concurrent part, the complementary, and then both of them sequence down into the next stage of their analysis. But it involves both qualitative interviews and quantitative survey work, as well as these different complementary and confirmatory designs.
Study of immigrants and non-immigrants in Atlanta and Philadelphia. SYNAP is our little, yes. So we're looking at U.S. Immigrant Relations. This are sort of following both of our interests and the interests of Dino Komodo and Linda Trop in this immigration into new destinations, and what exactly happens as immigrants move into these destinations. So what happens as different groups come into contact with one another? And so part of this was Russell Sage brought together a working group on cultural contact, and we were about a group of maybe 20, 25 of us, and we sort of presented our work, and then they said, go, do your thing, form some groups and come up with research projects. And ours was one of two that emerged from that culture, from that working group. And so we were interested in part because we realized that across the social sciences there's a conversation about what happens as different groups come into contact with one another. And so political scientists are incredibly pessimistic. They think that groups come into contact with one another, it inevitably leads to bad things. It's like either you have competition or you have threat or you have conflict, but there's inevitably going to be some kind of friction. We think about contact and where contact is occurring. So we're thinking about different kinds of social spaces. Again, a lot of this literature is about what happens in people's residential areas, so neighborhoods. We're also, in this project, looking at workspaces and public spaces. So 3 different kinds of social spaces, and then what happens when people come into contact. We have a wide array of data on the friendliness of the contact, the social status of the different people who are coming into contact with one another, all kinds of things. And how willing are they to welcome each other? Do they feel welcomed? Do they feel threatened? We have a number of different measures of perceived threat. So what do we think we're adding with these data is in part that a lot of these studies, particularly in social psychology, and actually a lot in political science sociology as well, have really been about black-white contact and less about how different groups interact with immigrants. If there are studies about how groups interact with immigrants, it's whites and immigrants. So here, part of what this study is doing is thinking about each of the 4 groups, so US-born whites, US-born blacks, and the 2 immigrant groups, which are Mexican and South Asian Indian, in relation to each other. So how blacks, US-born blacks think about each of the other 3 groups, how foreign-born Asian Indians think about each of the other 3 groups, thinking about different kinds of status hierarchies, and again, the way that the immigration literature thinks about status hierarchies, often through those kind of socioeconomic lens. So you're high status if you're educated and professional, so that would be the South Asian Indians, and low status if you're working class and have lower skills, or what we think of as lower skills, and those would be the Mexican immigrants. But one thing that Helen introduced very early on was thinking about status in a more complicated way, that there are multiple status hierarchies, and so you can be high on some status hierarchies and low on others. So South Asian Indians might be very well educated and working professions, but they also can be very dark-skinned, and they can also speak English with an accent, and they can also have different legal statuses. And so thinking about how different groups are fit as high or low across a range of social statuses. And this got us thinking, of course, about the selection of these 2 groups. We're going to talk a bit more about this representative sampling by Landford and Cell. This is a telephone survey in English and Spanish. We had quotas by age and gender. And we have this geocoding at the track level, which allows us to match the respondents to lots of other data, lots of other census data, and I'll tell you some more. We'll tell you some more about other kinds of things we've been matching to this, to their data, and then we followed this up. So this was 2013. We did the survey. 2014, we went the next summer, and interviewed a subsample of survey respondents who had agreed to be recontacted. So in the survey itself, we asked people toward the end, would you agree to be recontacted? And so we recontacted people a year later from the 4 groups, and in particular asking people about their interactions in public spaces and how they thought about public space. We did some kind of cool stuff with mapping, which we haven't really done anything with. But we asked people we gave people a map and said, okay, so tell us, like, what is your neighborhood? Draw your neighborhood. Like, where do you go shopping? Where do you go to the park? We haven't done anything with that. And so we had a team of graduate student interviewers, which we will talk about a bit more, who conducted the follow-up surveys, and then the PIs did another set of surveys with community and political leaders. So we essentially have 3 sets of data. We have the survey data, we have these follow-up interviews with largely with people from this who had filled out the survey, but not entirely, because it turned out to be very difficult to re-interview some of the immigrant groups, particularly the Mexican respondents. And so we ran out of people, and so we did snowball sampling from outside.
Michael mentioned it, but I want to go back and want to talk about this across the disciplines. In sociology and in political science, we often measure what we call contact, right? And we'll do it through these contextual variables, and it's very clear to us. We don't have the same conception of contact as our psychologist, Linda Trop, does. For psychologists, contact is face-to-face intergroup contact, and what its qualities and characteristics are. Is it equal status or not? Is it frequent? Is it close? Is it deep? Is it what, right? And for sociologists and for political scientists in general, not always, right? We don't go down to that granular level, right? We might think of where you live. We are talking about what psychologists think of as exposure or opportunity for contact, right? And we call it contact, or we assume that because of where you live, if you have opportunity, right, it's also contact. But these things are not the same. So we're trying to integrate measures in the survey data and in the interview data that get at both levels. Our survey data have a lot of robust contact effects, even when we pull in the contextual data and the controls and control for threat, just kind of throwing the sociologists and political scientists through a loop here. Just what do we do with this? There's more contact, positive contact effects in our data that are robust across all the groups across the two cities. Whoa. And in many ways that's kind of cool, right? Because studies in our disciplines don't often, again, include the face-to-face contact level with our broader contextual measures, and that's important. But what's going on, right? One of the things we're finding here is, yes, actually there's a ton of examples of positive quality contact, especially in neighborhoods, but sometimes at work, sometimes in other spaces. Even beyond that, right, there's examples of you know, contact that isn't necessarily positive or even welcoming, but that's just neutral or ambivalent or there and unremarkable, but it's just not hostile and it's not negative, right? But you can see an example here, just Atlanta, Indian 50038. But yeah, and that one time when my childhood classmate called me the N-word, what? Well, when we were 10 years old. Oh, wow, because he thought you were black? Yeah. But other than that, oh yeah, and also during the Iranian crisis, we got a lot of ugliness during that. But other than that, really, not that I can tell you, it's been a pretty smooth run, right? There are moments when our Indian sample, right, gets racialized quickly in anonymous public spaces, right? And it's by language, it's by race, it's by how they look. The Sikhs experience it in particular because of dress. And it's about skin tone and sometimes about kind of connection to Middle East or terrorism, right? But for the most part, right, this idea of kind of smooth ride except in these moments that are memorable. We also find, right, evidence of some of the mechanisms that's confirmatory that we're beginning to play around with our quantitative data. It's very clear to me that negative quality contact, whether it's acknowledged as full-scale discrimination or not, very quickly incites distrust. It's also related to threat, although in qualitative data, right, it's you can't pick out the causal relationship, so we're still playing with how it works in the quantitative data. By contrast, right, it's not the case that positive quality contact or neutral quality contact immediately incites trust. It doesn't do that, right? Or it immediately infers lack of threat, right? But what it does, and I think this is consistent with some of the trust literature, is it lays the basis for the long-term possible potential development of trust and other kinds of good outcomes, right? So these are asymmetric. Russell Hardin calls distrust and trust asymmetric, in that distrust comes quickly and it's very hard to repair, but trust actually has to develop over a long, long period of time, right? Such as Philadelphia Mexican, and the Mexicans actually are unique. They have the lowest levels of trust, highest levels of isolation, right? Not lowest levels of civic engagement, but they're depressed, right? So they're a unique group even among all four of the groups, right? But do you think the few people where you work now, do you think people trust each other? Yes. So this is unique. Most of our Mexicans didn't necessarily trust anyone, not even co-ethnics, right? What gives you that impression? Oh, that they trust each other? Well, I can call my supervisor for anything, and I can tell that she doesn't get mad. She's pleasant. Okay, that's good. Yeah, everybody seems nice. Good morning, how you doing? A lot of this hi, bye, it comes up in our coders over and over again. They call it wave culture. Our coders, our undergrads are called wave culture. Hi, bye, hi, bye. It doesn't mean that you trust someone, right? But it greases the wheels. It lays the basis. It signifies the absence of unwelcome, right? So when a Mexican in our sample says, I trust someone, what does that mean? Well, it's based upon our qualitative data showing kind of how that works, right? Another thing that our qualitative data are providing that are complementary to some of our survey findings, it shows how respondents make meaning of our key concepts, right? Michael was mentioning this earlier. What do focus groups do? What even can interviews do? Those are two different qualitative methods, right? And they're different also from ethnography. But they give you a lens into what is your core concepts and ways that you might be talking about and reading about from your discipline, but how are people understanding it on the ground?
Thank you for watching. Please watch the other videos in the series using the links below.